Have you ever pushed someone so far into the shadows that they had no choice but to bite back? When a 250-pound exhausted waitress snapped and threw a tray of scalding soup onto the pristine silk dress of Boston's most feared Mafia fiancé, everyone expected her to be dead by dawn. But the underworld doesn't operate on logic, and neither does dangerous obsession. This is the true story of spilled, blood-shattered expectations, and the chilling 4 words that changed everything. There is a specific kind of invisibility reserved for overweight women in high-end spaces. Chloe Bennet knew this invisibility intimately. At 260 pounds, standing 5'4", she was both the largest object in any room and the one most thoroughly ignored. Chloe worked at Laura, an outrageously overpriced velvet-draped Italian restaurant nestled deep in Boston's North End. It was the kind of establishment where politicians dined alongside organized crime figures, washing down plates of truffle risotto with $4,000 bottles of Barolo. The waitstaff at Laura usually looked like they had just stepped off a Milan runway, tall, angular, and effortlessly gliding between the closely packed tables. Chloe, with her wide hips, thick thighs, and a waist that strained against the stiff black fabric of her uniform apron, was the glaring exception. She had only gotten the job because the owner Lorenzo Bianchi owed her late father a favor from 30 years ago. Every shift was a physical and psychological marathon. The inner chafing of her thighs, the dull, throbbing ache in her lower back, the way her swollen feet screamed inside her cheap, non-slip orthopedic shoes. It was a symphony of discomfort. But the physical pain paled in comparison to the quiet indignities. The eye rolls from the maitre d' when she had to squeeze past him in the narrow kitchen corridor. The snapping fingers of wealthy patrons who treated her like a slow-moving piece of furniture. The cruel, whispered jokes from the younger, thinner waitresses in the break room. Chloe swallowed it all. She had rent to pay on a dilapidated apartment in Quincy, crippling medical debt left behind by her mother, and absolutely no safety net. She couldn't afford pride, until the night Dominic Costello walked in. Anyone who read the Boston Globe knew the Costello name. They controlled the ports, the illegal gambling rings running out of Southie, and had their hands deep in the city's real estate development. Dominic was the newly crowned head of the family, having taken over after his uncle's sudden, violent demise. He was 32, striking in a brutal, uncompromising way. He had sharp, hawkish features, eyes the color of dark slate, and an aura of absolute authority that sucked the oxygen out of the room. When Dominic moved, the world stopped and watched. But Chloe's attention wasn't on Dominic. It was on the woman draped over his arm, Vivian Kensington. Vivian was the daughter of a corrupt state senator, a strategic alliance disguised as a romance. She was a walking embodiment of everything Chloe was not. Vivian was rail-thin, with razor-sharp cheekbones, platinum blonde hair, and a bespoke emerald-green silk slip dress that clung to her fragile frame like a second skin. She moved with the arrogant entitlement of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. Vivian thrived on superiority. She breathed it in like oxygen. As Lorenzo frantically cleared out the VIP section to accommodate the Costello entourage, a ripple of panic tore through the kitchen. The head waitress, a stunning brunette named Sophia, was hyperventilating in the bathroom, terrified of messing up the order for the cartel boss. Lorenzo, sweating profusely, grabbed Chloe by the arm. "You—" Lorenzo hissed his fingers, digging into Chloe's thick bicep. "You serve them. You keep your head down, you don't speak unless spoken to, and you get the order right. If you screw this up, Chloe, I don't care about the debt I owed your father. You're done." Chloe felt a cold spike of dread in her stomach. She wiped her clammy hands on her apron, her chest heaving slightly. "Mr. Bianchi Vivian Kensington hates me. She was here last month and complained that I was ruining the aesthetic of her meal. I don't care, Lorenzo snapped. Go. Carrying a silver tray with crystal water goblets, Chloe made her way to the VIP section. The table was surrounded by 4 massive bodyguards, men whose tailored suits bulged unnaturally at the ribs. Dominic sat at the head of the table, scrolling casually through his phone, looking entirely bored. Vivian was leaning into him, trailing a manicured finger down his lapel, speaking in a high, breathy voice. "Good evening," Chloe murmured, keeping her eyes glued to the white linen tablecloth as she carefully placed a goblet in front of Dominic. "Welcome to Laura." Vivian stopped mid-sentence. Her cold blue eyes snapped up, raking over Chloe's heavy frame. A cruel, razor-thin smile curled her lips. Oh, God. Lorenzo really needs to lower his hiring standards. Dominic, darling, look. It's the Michelin Man. A few of the bodyguards chuckled darkly. Chloe felt the blood rush to her cheeks, a hot, humiliating flush that burned all the way to the tips of her ears. She kept her head down desperately, trying to pour the ice water without her hands shaking. Dominic didn't laugh. He slowly raised his eyes from his phone, his slate-grey gaze locking onto Chloe. For a terrifying second, Chloe felt entirely exposed, as if he could see right through the cheap polyester of her uniform, past the thick layers of fat she used as armor, straight into her terrified, exhausted soul. He didn't say a word. He just watched her. "Are you deaf or just slow?" Vivian snapped her voice, cutting through the heavy silence. "I asked for sparkling water with a twist of lemon, not this tap garbage. God, do you spend all your time eating in the back instead of learning how to do your job?" "I apologize, miss," Chloe said softly, her voice trembling. "I'll get that for you right away." "Don't bother," Vivian sneered. She deliberately knocked her elbow against the table, sending the heavy crystal goblet toppling over. Ice water spilled across the pristine tablecloth, cascading over the edge and splashing directly onto Chloe's black shoes and thick black tights. "Oops," Vivian said, her tone dripping with venom. "Clean that up, and try not to crush the table when you bend over." Chloe stood frozen, the icy water seeping through her shoes. The entire restaurant seemed to have gone dead silent. She looked down at the puddle, then up at Vivian's triumphant, vicious face. She had spent her entire life swallowing her anger, compressing her dignity to make room for other people's cruelty. But tonight, something deep inside the heavy, exhausted waitress began to crack. Chloe could feel the eyes of the bodyguards on her, heavy and expectant. She could feel Lorenzo panicking from across the dining room. And most intensely, she could feel Dominic Costello's gaze, unblinking and entirely unreadable. Mechanically, Chloe grabbed the thick cloth napkins from her apron and knelt down on the hard wood floor. Her bad knee popped loudly, a sound that elicited another sharp giggle from Vivian. Chloe dabbed at the spilled water, her hands moving numbly. "Make sure you get it all," Vivian purred, leaning over so her blonde hair almost brushed the table. "You missed a spot right by my shoe. Or is your stomach in the way so you can't see it?" Chloe closed her eyes. "Just breathe," she told herself. "Just clean it up and walk away. You need this job. You need the money." She finished wiping the floor, gathered the wet napkins, and stood up, her thighs burning from the effort. "I will bring your appetizers out shortly," Chloe said, her voice completely hollow. The first course went by in agonizing tension. Chloe brought out the antipasto, the burrata, the thinly sliced prosciutto. Every time she approached the table, Vivian found a new way to torment her. She complained the plates were too heavy for Chloe to carry without sweating. She loudly asked Dominic if he thought obesity was contagious. Through it all, Dominic remained eerily silent. He ate his food methodically, sipping his whiskey, his eyes tracking Chloe's movements with a predatory stillness. He wasn't joining in on Vivian's cruelty, but he wasn't stopping it either. To Chloe, his silence was an endorsement. The breaking point arrived with the main course. Chloe was carrying a massive, heavy tray, balanced on her shoulder, loaded with a steaming bowl of lobster linguine, a plate of veal scallopini, and a side of roasted asparagus, drenched in garlic butter. Her shoulder screamed in protest under the weight her back muscles locking up. As she approached the table, Vivian was mid-rant about a socialite she hated. Chloe stepped up to the side of the table, carefully lowering the heavy tray to the serving stand. "Excuse me," Chloe murmured, reaching out to place the veal in front of Dominic. Vivian suddenly shifted in her chair, extending her long, stiletto-clad leg directly into Chloe's path. It wasn't an accident. Chloe felt the sharp point of the heel hook around her thick ankle. She tried to catch her balance, but her momentum was already forward. With a sickening lurch, Chloe stumbled. The heavy ceramic plate of veal scallopini tipped, slipping from her grasp. She managed to catch it before it hit the floor, but the hot, buttery sauce splashed violently over the edge, landing directly on the hem of Vivian's emerald green silk dress. Vivian shrieked. It was a piercing, glass-shattering sound. She leaped up from her chair, staring at the greasy stain ruining the $4,000 silk. "You stupid fat cow!" Vivian screamed, her face contorting with absolute rage. "Look at what you did. Look at my dress. I'm sorry you tripped me." Chloe started her heart, pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I tripped you. You clumsy, massive whale, you tripped over your own disgusting feet." Vivian lunged forward. Before Chloe could even process the movement, Vivian's hand cracked across Chloe's face. The slap echoed through the hushed restaurant like a gunshot. Chloe's head snapped to the side. A sharp, stinging heat bloomed across her cheek. The metallic taste of blood flooded her mouth, where her teeth had bitten into the soft tissue of her inner cheek. For 3 seconds, the world stopped turning. Lorenzo gasped from the bar. The bodyguards tensed their hands, dropping to their suit jackets. Dominic slowly set down his fork, his slate eyes narrowing into dark slits. Vivian stood there, chest heaving, a cruel, satisfied smirk returning to her lips. "Get out of my sight. Go get the manager. You are fired, you disgusting—" Something snapped. It wasn't a metaphor. Chloe literally heard a popping sound in her mind, like a thick cable snapping under immense pressure. Decades of being mocked, of being invisible, of starving herself on fad diets, only to gain it all back, of being treated like a subhuman creature because she took up too much space. It all rushed to the surface in a blinding wave of pure, unadulterated fury. Chloe didn't cry. She didn't run away. Instead, her large, heavy hand shot out with terrifying speed. She grabbed a fistful of Vivian's pristine blonde hair, ripping the woman backward. Vivian let out a strangled, terrified gasp. With her other hand, Chloe grabbed the silver tureen of leftover garlic butter sauce that sat on the serving tray. Without a second's hesitation, Chloe dumped the entire container over Vivian's head. The warm, greasy, garlic-scented oil cascaded down Vivian's platinum hair, smearing her flawless makeup and soaking into the bodice of her ruined silk dress. "Ah!" Vivian shrieked, flailing wildly, her manicured nails clawing at the air. "I'm done being your punching bag." Chloe snarled her voice, a low, terrifying growl that she didn't even recognize as her own. Because of her weight, she had tremendous leverage and physical power. She shoved Vivian backward. Vivian's stilettos slipped on the buttery floor, and the Mafia boss's fiancé crashed hard onto the floor, taking a chair down with her in a tangle of limbs and greasy silk. Chaos erupted. The 4 bodyguards instantly drew their weapons. The terrifying sound of metal sliding against metal filled the dining room as 4 handguns were leveled directly at Chloe's chest. Waitresses screamed. Patrons dove under their tables. Chloe stood frozen, breathing heavily, her chest heaving against her tight apron. The butter dripped from her hands. She looked at the guns pointed at her, and a strange, detached calm washed over her. Well, she thought numbly, this is it. I'm going to die. Vivian, sobbing hysterically on the floor, wiped grease from her eyes. Kill her, she shrieked, pointing a trembling, buttery finger at Chloe. Shoot that fat bitch right now. The lead bodyguard clicked off his safety. Stand down. The voice was low, gravelly, and commanded absolute obedience. Dominic Costello stood up. He didn't rush. He didn't pull a weapon. He casually buttoned his suit jacket, his eyes locked onto Chloe. He didn't look angry. He didn't look offended. To Chloe's absolute horror and confusion, Dominic Costello looked fascinated. Dominic! Vivian wailed from the floor, sounding like a spoiled child. Look at me. Look at what she did. Tell Matteo to shoot her. Dominic didn't even glance down at his fiancée. He kept his eyes on Chloe, tracking the defiant, terrified fire in her eyes, the heavy rise and fall of her chest, the red handprint glowing fiercely on her pale cheek. I said, stand down. Dominic repeated, his voice dangerously soft. Instantly the bodyguards lowered their weapons, though they kept their hands on the grips. Dominic slowly walked around the table, his expensive leather shoes crunching on spilled ice. He stopped just 2 feet away from Chloe. He was incredibly tall, forcing Chloe to tilt her head up to meet his gaze. Up close, the danger radiating off him was palpable. He smelled of expensive cedar cologne, whiskey, and gunpowder. He raised a hand. Chloe flinched, bracing for the blow, shutting her eyes tight. But the blow never came. Instead, she felt the rough pad of his thumb gently brush against the corner of her mouth, wiping away a tiny drop of blood where her lip had split. His touch was electric, burning against her skin. Chloe's eyes flew open in shock. Dominic stared into her eyes, a dark, predatory smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Go home, he whispered softly, his voice meant only for her. What? Chloe breathed, trembling violently. Get out the back door before I change my mind. Run. Chloe didn't need to be told twice. She turned and bolted toward the kitchen, her heavy footsteps thudding against the floorboards, leaving the most powerful man in Boston staring after her with a look of intense, burning curiosity. The rain in Boston that night was torrential, washing the streets in a cold, unforgiving downpour. Chloe didn't take the bus. She walked the 3 miles back to her cramped apartment in Quincy, her uniform soaked through to the skin, her heavy shoes squelching with every step. She was numb. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a cold, crushing reality. She had just assaulted Vivian Kensington. She had humiliated the fiancé of the head of the Costello family in front of his men. Women had disappeared into the Charles River for much, much less. By the time she reached her apartment, a miserable ground-floor unit with peeling beige wallpaper and a radiator that clanked loudly, she was shivering uncontrollably. She locked the deadbolt. Then she dragged the heavy wooden dresser in front of the door. Her phone had been buzzing constantly. 6 voicemails from Lorenzo Bianchi. She didn't need to listen to them to know she was fired, blacklisted, and entirely on her own. Chloe stripped off her wet uniform, leaving it in a pathetic pile on the bathroom floor. She caught a glimpse of herself in the cracked mirror above the sink. The red mark from Vivian's hand was turning into a bruised, purplish shadow on her round cheek. She stared at her broad shoulders, the rolls of flesh around her middle, the heavy curve of her hips. Society told her she was weak because of her size. But tonight, that weight, that mass, had given her the strength to throw a monster down. For a brief, fleeting second, she felt a surge of fierce pride. Then the terror returned. She put on an oversized grey sweatpants and an old, faded t-shirt. She dragged a battered suitcase from under her bed and started throwing things into it. Socks, underwear, her mother's old silver locket, the envelope with her meager savings, $340 in loose 20s. It wasn't enough to get far, but maybe she could take a Greyhound bus out of state. Vermont, or maybe Ohio. Somewhere the Costello family wouldn't bother to look. Bang, bang, bang! Chloe froze. The cheap t-shirt slipped from her fingers. Bang, bang, bang! It was 3 sharp, rhythmic knocks on her apartment door. Not the frantic pounding of a landlord, but the calm, authoritative knock of someone who knew exactly who was inside and knew they had nowhere to run. Her heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. She backed away from the door, grabbing a heavy cast-iron skillet from the cramped kitchenette. It was a pathetic weapon against Mafia hitmen, but she wasn't going to go down without a fight. Chloe, the voice penetrated the thin wooden door. It wasn't a thug. It wasn't Matteo, the bodyguard. It was him, Dominic Costello. Chloe's breath hitched. Why was he here? Why the boss himself? Did he come to pull the trigger, personally, to avenge Vivian's honor? I know you're in there, Chloe. Dominic's voice was smooth, carrying effortlessly over the sound of the rain lashing against the windows. Your heart is beating so loud I can hear it through the wood. Move the dresser. Open the door. Go away, Chloe screamed, her voice cracking with pure terror. I've called the police. A low, dark chuckle echoed from the hallway. No, you haven't. And even if you did, the Quincy precinct captain is on my payroll. He wouldn't dispatch a car here if you were on fire. Open the door, Chloe. I am not going to ask a 3rd time. If Matteo kicks this door down, he'll likely break it, and then you'll have to pay your landlord for the damages. The terrifying pragmatism of his threat broke her resolve. She was trapped. She was just a fat, broke, exhausted waitress, and he was a god in this city. With shaking hands, Chloe set down the skillet. She pushed the heavy dresser aside, unlocking the deadbolt with a loud click. She pulled the door open a few inches. Dominic stood in the dim, flickering light of the hallway. He had ditched the suit jacket and tie. He wore a crisp, dark button-down shirt, the top buttons undone, revealing a glimpse of dark ink across his collarbone. He looked lethal, relaxed, and impossibly handsome. The bodyguard Matteo stood silently a few feet down the hall, arms crossed, staring straight ahead. "May I come in?" Dominic asked politely, though the look in his eyes made it clear it wasn't a request. Chloe stepped back, silently clutching her oversized t-shirt as if it could protect her. Dominic stepped into the tiny, dingy apartment. He seemed too large for the room, his presence completely overpowering the space. His slate eyes swept over the peeling wallpaper, the leaky ceiling, and finally settled on the half-packed suitcase on the bed. "Going somewhere?" he asked, mildly, clasping his hands behind his back. "Are you going to kill me?" Chloe blurted out, her voice trembling. "Because if you are, just do it. Don't play games with me. I know I humiliated her. I know I signed my own death warrant." Dominic turned to look at her. He studied her face, taking in the bruised cheek, the messy hair, her wide, terrified brown eyes. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Chloe instinctively backed up until her spine hit the cheap drywall. He stopped right in front of her. He reached out, and Chloe flinched, but he only raised his hand to gently trace the outer edge of the bruise Vivian had left. "Kill you," Dominic murmured, his voice a low, mesmerizing rumble. "Chloe, do you have any idea how much I despise Vivian Kensington?" Chloe blinked, her brain misfiring. What? "She is a spoiled, screeching parasite," Dominic said, coldly dropping his hand. "My family arranged the engagement for political cover. I endure her because she serves a purpose. But tonight, watching her complain, watching her abuse my staff, watching her treat you like dirt beneath her shoes, it was exhausting." He stepped closer, the scent of cedar and whiskey wrapping around Chloe. And then Dominic whispered, his eyes flashing with a dark, dangerous heat. "You grabbed her. I watched a woman who has been told her entire life to be small finally realize how big she actually is. You pinned a senator's daughter to the floor and covered her in grease. It was the most magnificently violent thing I have seen in years." I lost my temper. Chloe stammered, entirely lost in the gravitational pull of his presence. She tripped me. She slapped me, and you retaliated. Dominic said, a genuine smile finally breaking across his stoic features. It made him look devastating. You didn't cower. You didn't cry. You fought back. I respect power, Chloe. And what you did tonight was an absolute display of power. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, tossing it onto the small kitchenette counter. What is that? Chloe asked, staring at it. $50,000, Dominic said casually. Cash. Consider it an apology for my fiancé's behavior and severance pay for Lorenzo firing you. Chloe's jaw dropped. 50,000, I can't take that. You can and you will, Dominic commanded softly. But that is not the only reason I am here. Chloe's breath caught. Why are you here? Dominic reached out his large, calloused hands, gripping Chloe's thick waist. He didn't hesitate or show disgust. He gripped her firmly, pulling her slightly forward, so she was pressed against his chest. Chloe gasped at the contact, a jolt of pure electricity shooting straight to her core. No man had touched her in years, and certainly no man like him. Because I want you, Dominic whispered, lowering his head so his lips were mere inches from her ear. I am surrounded by thin, hollow, fragile people who only know how to take. But you are real. You are solid. And the fire in your eyes when you threw her to the ground, it woke something up inside me, Chloe. Something very dark and very permanent. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. The slate grey of his irises was burning with a terrifying, possessive intensity. Tomorrow morning, a car will be outside this apartment. Dominic stated his tone, leaving no room for argument. You are not running to Ohio. You are not packing this bag. You are coming to my estate. I am going to put you under my protection. Dominic, you have a fiancé. Chloe whispered, her mind spinning wildly. You're a mafia boss. I'm a fat, broke waitress. This doesn't make sense. I make the rules in this city. Dominic said, his grip tightening slightly on her waist, sending a flush of heat radiating through her body. And as of tonight, my rule is simple. You belong to me now. And if Vivian or anyone else in this city ever tries to touch you again. He leaned in, his lips brushing softly against the bruise on her cheek, making Chloe shiver violently. I will burn their entire world to the ground. The black Cadillac Escalade sat idling outside Chloe's Quincy apartment exactly at 7 a.m., its tinted windows gleaming under the pale morning sun. Matteo, the stoic bodyguard from the restaurant, stood by the open rear door. He didn't sneer, didn't judge the peeling paint of her building, and didn't mock the fact that Chloe was wearing her only clean outfit, a faded navy blue cardigan and stretched denim jeans that had seen better days. He simply offered a respectful nod. Miss Bennett, the boss is expecting you. Stepping into the leather-scented interior of the SUV felt like crossing the event horizon of a black hole. There was no going back to the invisible, exhausted life she had known. As the car merged onto the I-93, carrying her toward Brookline, Chloe clutched the heavy envelope of cash in her lap. $50,000. It was more money than her mother had made in 2 years of scrubbing floors. It felt like blood money, but it also felt like freedom. The Costello estate was a sprawling, fortified compound tucked behind 10-foot-high wrought-iron gates and ancient oak trees. It was a fortress disguised as a 1920s Tudor mansion. When the heavy mahogany front doors opened, Chloe was greeted by a petite, fiercely elegant older woman named Rosa, who managed the estate's staff. Welcome, Bella, Rosa said warmly, taking Chloe's battered suitcase without a hint of condescension. Mr. Costello had the East Wing prepared for you. I have also taken the liberty of stocking your closets. Chloe followed Rosa up the grand, sweeping staircase, her thick thighs brushing together beneath her jeans, feeling the acute, heavy awareness of her own body in this palace of glass, marble, and impossible wealth. The suite Rosa led her into was larger than Chloe's entire apartment building. But it was the closet that stopped Chloe in her tracks. It wasn't filled with the standard sample-sized designer wear that women like Vivian Kensington flaunted. Hanging on the velvet racks were dozens of custom-tailored garments, silk robes, cashmere sweaters, tailored slacks, and flowing dresses, all meticulously sized for a plus-size woman. There were wide calf leather boots, high-end supportive lingerie, and soft cotton loungewear. Dominic had these flown in overnight from a boutique in New York, Rosa noted, catching Chloe's stunned expression. He was very specific about your measurements. He wants you comfortable. He wants you to know you belong here. Tears pricked the corners of Chloe's eyes. For 26 years, the world had demanded she shrink, apologize, and hide her bulk under cheap, shapeless polyester. Dominic Costello had looked at her and built a wardrobe meant to worship her exactly as she was. But outside the serene walls of her new suite, the Costello syndicate was tearing itself apart over her arrival. In the soundproofed basement of the estate, Dominic sat at the head of a long steel table. The air was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Across from him sat Silvio, his underboss, a ruthless man who managed the family's extortion rackets in the Seaport district. "You're out of your mind, Dom," Silvio spat, slamming his hand on the table. "Senator Charles Kensington called me at 3 in the morning. Vivian is hysterical. The DA is threatening to look into our South Boston zoning permits. And for what you threw a political alliance down the drain for a waitress who belongs in a bakery, the other capos around the table shifted uncomfortably, waiting for the explosion. Dominic slowly exhaled a plume of blue smoke, his slate eyes dead and utterly devoid of warmth. "Careful, Silvio. You are speaking about the woman sleeping under my roof. She's a liability," Silvio shot back, emboldened by his own anger. "You humiliated the senator's daughter in front of your own men. We look weak. We look like we're being led by a man thinking with his—" In a blur of motion so fast it defied his large frame, Dominic lunged across the steel table. His hand clamped around Silvio's throat like a steel vice, cutting off the underboss's words with a sickening gurgle. Dominic dragged Silvio halfway across the table, knocking over ashtrays and whiskey glasses. "I am the head of this family," Dominic whispered, his voice a lethal vibrating hum that commanded absolute terror. "I dictate our alliances. Kensington needs my money for his re-election campaign, far more than I need his political cover. If he wants to pull the DA on us, I have enough blackmail on his offshore accounts to bury him in federal prison until he rots. And as for Chloe," Dominic tightened his grip until Silvio's face turned a violent shade of purple. "Kudobu Ursum. She is under my protection. If any man in this room or any soldier on the street speaks of her with anything less than absolute reverence, I will personally remove their tongue. Do we have an understanding?" Dominic released him. Silvio collapsed back into his chair, gasping desperately for air, clutching his bruised throat and nodding frantically. "Good." Dominic adjusted his cuffs, his demeanor instantly returning to icy calm. "Clean up this mess. I have a guest to attend to." When Dominic entered Chloe's suite an hour later, the violence was entirely washed from his aura. Chloe was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, wearing a deep burgundy silk wrap dress that draped flawlessly over her wide hips and heavy bust, clinging to her thick curves in a way that made her look like a Renaissance painting. Dominic stopped in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. The raw, heavy beauty of her struck him like a physical blow. "You look," Dominic murmured, stepping into the room, his eyes dark with undisguised hunger. "Exactly as you were meant to." Chloe turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Dominic, this is too much." The clothes, the room. Why are you doing this? I'm just a nobody. Dominic closed the distance between them. He reached out his large hands, resting on her waist, pulling her flush against him. He loved the solid, substantial feel of her. He loved that she wasn't fragile. You are not a nobody, Chloe. You are the only real thing in a world of plastic and lies, he said, his thumb tracing her jawline. I've spent my life surrounded by people who smile at me while plotting to slit my throat. But you spilled grease on a senator's daughter because you demanded your own dignity. You're fiercely brave. And you are mine. He leaned down, and for the first time his lips claimed hers. It wasn't a gentle probing kiss. It was a brand. It was hungry, possessive, and entirely consuming. Chloe gasped, her hands instinctively wrapping around his broad shoulders, melting into the sheer, overwhelming heat of the city's most dangerous man, laying claim to her soul. 3 days passed in a surreal, intoxicating haze. Chloe remained within the fortified walls of the Brookline estate. She ate meals prepared by a private chef, swam in the indoor heated pool, and spent her nights wrapped in Dominic's heavy protective embrace. He was obsessed with her body, tracing the stretch marks on her stomach, with quiet reverence, kissing the heavy flesh of her thighs, as if she were a goddess to be worshipped, rather than a secret to be hidden. For the first time in her life, Chloe didn't feel fat. She felt powerful. She felt desired. But outside the gates, Vivian Kensington's rage was metastasizing into sheer, unadulterated madness. The socialite had spent 3 days hiding in her father's Beacon Hill penthouse, scrubbing garlic butter from her scalp and staring at her bruised ego in the mirror. Dominic had completely cut her off, ignoring her calls and barring her from his properties. The humiliation of being cast aside for a 260-pound penniless waitress was a poison eating her alive. Vivian didn't just want Chloe gone, she wanted her destroyed. On Thursday afternoon, Dominic had to travel to the shipping ports in East Boston to personally oversee an incoming shipment of untraceable firearms. He took Matteo and a heavy detail with him, leaving the estate relatively quiet. He had assured Chloe she was perfectly safe, guarded by the perimeter security. But a fortress is only as strong as its weakest guard. Russo was a mid-level security man on Dominic's payroll who had a crippling gambling debt. Vivian had found out about it. A wire transfer of $100,000 from a shell account was all it took for Russo to conveniently disable the cameras in the East Wing solarium and leave the garden terrace door unlocked. Chloe was sitting in the sunlit solarium reading a novel and enjoying a cup of chamomile tea, wearing a soft emerald-green lounge set. She felt peaceful. The heavy glass doors slid open with a soft whoosh. Chloe looked up, expecting to see Rosa. Instead, the blood drained entirely from her face. Vivian Kensington stood in the doorway. She was flanked by a massive, heavily tattooed enforcer named Lenny, a freelance thug known in the underground for doing the dirty work the established families refused to touch. Vivian was dressed in a sharp black trench coat, her platinum hair pulled back tight, her blue eyes wide and manic. "Well, well, well," Vivian sneered, stepping into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Look at the pig in her new pen." Chloe stood up instantly, her heart rocketing into her throat. Her mind raced. Where were the guards? Where was Rosa? "How did you get in here?" Chloe demanded, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the terror icing her veins. "Money opens every door in this city, sweetheart," Vivian mocked, slowly walking around the perimeter of the room, looking at the plush furniture with disgust. "Did you really think you could humiliate me, steal my fiancé, and just hide in this house, eating bonbons? Dominic isn't yours," Chloe said, her hands balling into fists at her sides. The timid, broken waitress from Laura was dead. Dominic had resurrected someone much stronger. "He threw you out. Leave Vivian before he comes back. You know what he'll do to you. Vivian's face contorted with ugly, visceral hatred. "He's under a spell. It's a sick temporary fetish, you disgusting whale. Once I get rid of you, he'll remember where his true loyalties lie. Lenny." The massive thug stepped forward, pulling a heavy, suppressed pistol from his jacket. He pointed it directly at Chloe's chest. "Take her to the cliffside at the quarry," Vivian ordered coldly. "Make sure it looks like she slipped. Fat people are clumsy, after all." Lenny grinned, revealing stained teeth, and stepped toward Chloe. "Come quietly, big girl. Don't make me drag you." Adrenaline pure and sharp as shattered glass flooded Chloe's system. She was cornered. She had no weapon. But as Lenny reached out to grab her arm, Chloe remembered what she had learned at the restaurant. Her weight was not a weakness. It was physics. It was momentum. As Lenny's hand clamped onto her bicep, Chloe didn't pull away. Instead, she threw her entire 260-pound frame forward, directly into him. Lenny, expecting resistance and a tug of war, was caught completely off guard by the massive sudden shift in gravity. Chloe rammed her heavy shoulder directly into his chest. The impact was brutal. Lenny gasped as all the air was forced from his lungs, his boots slipping on the slick marble. They crashed to the floor together. The suppressed pistol clattered out of Lenny's hand, sliding across the room. "Get the gun!" Vivian shrieked, panicking as her hired muscle went down under Chloe's bulk. Chloe scrambled, pinning Lenny's arm with her thick knee, her weight rendering him temporarily immobile. She lunged for a heavy, solid bronze statue of a greyhound resting on the coffee table. As Lenny bucked his hips, trying to throw her off, Chloe brought the heavy bronze statue down hard in a sweeping arc, smashing it directly into the side of Lenny's skull. The thug groaned, his eyes rolling back in his head, and went limp beneath her. Panting heavily, Chloe pushed herself up off the unconscious man. She turned to look at Vivian. Vivian was frozen, her eyes darting from her downed enforcer to the suppressed pistol lying 10 feet away. She made a desperate dive for the weapon, but Chloe was closer. With a heavy thudding stomp, Chloe's custom leather boot slammed down directly onto Vivian's outstretched hand, trapping it against the marble floor, inches from the gun. Vivian screamed a shrill sound of pure agony, bones grinding under Chloe's weight. "I told you," Chloe said, her voice dark and breathless, her chest heaving as she stared down at the terrified socialite. "I am done being your punching bag." Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the solarium burst open. Dominic Costello stood in the doorway. He was breathless, his tie discarded, a terrifying look of absolute murderous rage radiating from every pore of his body. Matteo and 3 other guards rushed in behind him, their assault rifles raised. Russo, the traitorous guard, was dragged into the room by the collar, his face beaten into a bloody pulp. Dominic had discovered the compromised security feed halfway to the docks and had driven his Escalade back at 90 miles an hour. Dominic took in the scene, the unconscious hitman on the floor, the blood, and Chloe standing tall and defiant, her heavy boot pinning Vivian Kensington to the marble. The tension in Dominic's shoulders instantly dissolved into a dark, fiercely proud smirk. "Matteo." Dominic said, his voice eerily calm as he walked toward Chloe. "Clear this trash out of my house." The guards dragged Lenny's unconscious body away. Matteo grabbed Vivian by the hair, hauling the sobbing, terrified woman to her feet. "Dominic, please," Vivian wailed, cradling her crushed hand. "She attacked me. You have to believe me." Dominic didn't even look at Vivian. He stepped up to Chloe, gently taking the heavy bronze statue from her trembling hands and setting it aside. He pulled her into his chest, wrapping his arms around her waist, kissing the top of her head. "Take the senator's daughter to the basement," Dominic ordered over Chloe's shoulder, his tone plunging into freezing, unforgiving darkness. "Call her father. Tell him his political career is officially over. And tell him if he ever wants to see his precious daughter in one piece again, He will sign over the deed to the entire seaport development by midnight. Dominic, no! Vivian screamed as she was dragged backward into the hallway. When the doors closed, silence fell over the solarium. Chloe buried her face in Dominic's chest, the adrenaline finally crashing, leaving her shaking. "I have you," Dominic whispered fiercely, lifting her chin to look into her tear-filled eyes. "You protected yourself. You protected our home. No one will ever touch you again, Chloe. I swear it on my life." The fallout from Vivian's catastrophic breach of the Brookline estate was swift, clinical, and absolutely devastating. Dominic Costello did not deal in half measures. By midnight, Senator Charles Kensington was sitting in the soundproofed basement of the Costello compound. He was a man accustomed to power, usually holding court in velvet-lined chambers in Beacon Hill, but here, stripped of his security detail, and staring down the barrel of Mateo's gun, the senator looked remarkably small. He signed the deed to the billion-dollar seaport development without uttering a single word of protest. The offshore accounts, the bribes from the teachers' union, the illegal campaign contributions, Dominic laid the man's entire corrupt soul bare on a steel table. As for Vivian, there would be no grand Mafia execution. Dominic knew that death was too merciful for a narcissist. Instead, he systematically dismantled her reality. The senator, terrified of federal prison, publicly disowned her. Her credit cards were frozen, her trust fund seized under the guise of an IRS investigation Dominic had orchestrated with a dirty judge. Vivian Kensington, the untouchable socialite, was quietly shipped off to a dilapidated state-run psychiatric facility in rural Maine, stripped of her silk dresses, and her arrogance left with nothing but the haunting memory of the heavy waitress who had stolen her crown. But the removal of the Kensingtons created a dangerous vacuum, and in the underworld, vacuums are filled with blood. A week after the solarium attack, the tension within the Costello syndicate reached a boiling point. Silvio, the underboss, who had barely survived Dominic's wrath in the boardroom, saw an opportunity. With the Kensington political shield gone, Silvio believed the family was vulnerable. More importantly, he believed Dominic was weak, distracted by his bizarre obsession with Chloe. Silvio secretly reached out to Declan O'Connor, the vicious head of the Irish mob operating out of Charlestown. The deal was simple. Silvio would provide the access codes to the Brookline estate. Declan's hitters would wipe out Dominic and his inner circle, and Silvio would take the throne, giving the Irish the docks in Sorthia's payment. It was a flawless plan, executed on a rainy Tuesday night at 3 a.m. Chloe was awake. The psychological toll of the past few weeks had left her with bouts of insomnia. She slipped out of the heavy tangled sheets of Dominic's massive California king bed. She wrapped a thick velvet robe around her soft, heavy curves and walked quietly down the hall toward the kitchen to get a glass of water. As she passed the massive bay windows overlooking the sprawling back gardens, something caught her eye. The security floodlights, usually a blinding white, had been cut. The estate was submerged in an unnatural, inky blackness, but a flash of lightning illuminated the grounds for a fraction of a second. In that brief electric blue flash, Chloe saw them. 5 men dressed in tactical black, carrying suppressed submachine guns, moving silently across the wet lawn toward the terrace doors. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. The girl who used to cry in the restaurant bathroom was gone. Chloe turned and sprinted back down the hall, her heavy bare feet slapping quietly against the imported Persian runners. She burst into the master bedroom. "Dominic!" she hissed, shaking his broad shoulder violently. Dominic was awake instantly, the sleep vanishing from his slate eyes in a millisecond. He didn't ask questions. He read the pure urgency in her face. 5 men, armed, in the garden. Chloe breathed, her chest heaving. The lights are cut. Dominic rolled out of bed, pulling a heavy Glock 19 from the biometric safe on his nightstand. He tossed a smaller silver revolver to Chloe. "Stay behind the oak armoire. Do not come out." The next 10 minutes were a symphony of violence. The assassins breached the first floor, but Dominic and his night guard, Matteo, were already waiting in the shadows of the grand staircase. The silence of the house was shattered by the deafening roar of unsuppressed gunfire. Wood splintered. Glass shattered. The smell of cordite and copper flooded the air. Upstairs, Chloe gripped the cold silver of the revolver. Her hands shook, but she kept her eyes glued to the bedroom door. Suddenly the door handle turned. A sixth man, a straggler who had scaled the balcony, slipped into the room. He was looking toward the hallway, his gun raised, unaware of the heavy woman standing perfectly still in the dark corner. He took one step toward the bed. Chloe didn't hesitate. She raised the heavy revolver, leveled it at the center of the man's mass, and pulled the trigger. The kickback bruised her palm, the gunshot ringing in her ears like a physical blow. The intruder dropped instantly, a dark stain spreading across the expensive carpet. The gunfire downstairs ceased. Footsteps pounded up the stairs. Dominic burst into the room, covered in drywall dust and a splatter of blood that wasn't his. He saw the dead hitman on the floor, and then he saw Chloe, still holding the smoking gun, her chest rising and falling heavily beneath her velvet robe. Dominic walked over to her. He took the gun from her trembling hand and set it on the dresser. Then he grabbed her face in both hands, kissing her with a fierce, desperate, terrifying passion. Silvio gave them the codes. Dominic growled against her lips, his eyes burning with lethal clarity. "He thought you made me weak. He thought you were a liability." Dominic pulled back, looking at the dead man, then down at the magnificent, formidable woman in his arms. "You didn't just save my life tonight, Chloe," he whispered. "You solidified your place in this family. By sunrise, Silvio's head will be on a spike, and every capo in this city will know exactly who stands beside me." 6 months later, Boston's autumn air was crisp, swirling with dead leaves and the biting chill of the Atlantic. The city's criminal landscape had been entirely redrawn. Silvio's betrayal had been met with a purge so ruthless it made the front page of the Boston Globe for a week straight. Declan O'Connor was missing, presumed buried in the foundation of the new Seaport luxury condos. Dominic Costello's grip on the city was absolute titanium-clad and uncontested, and at the center of his dark empire sat Chloe. She had not shrunk. She had not gone on a desperate diet to fit into the narrow, shallow molds of the mob wives who gossiped in the salons of Back Bay. In fact, she had blossomed. She wore her size like armor, moving with a slow, deliberate majesty that demanded the room's attention. It was a Friday night, and a fleet of black SUVs pulled up to the curb in the North End. They were parked directly in front of Laura. The restaurant was exactly as Chloe remembered it. The velvet drapes, the crystal chandeliers, the suffocating scent of truffles, and expensive ego. But the dynamic had entirely inverted. When Dominic and Chloe stepped through the heavy glass doors, the entire restaurant went dead silent. Chloe wore a custom-tailored floor-length gown of midnight blue crushed velvet. The heavy fabric clung to her thick curves, accentuating her wide hips and heavy bust. A diamond necklace worth more than the entire restaurant rested against her collarbone. Dominic walked beside her, his hand resting possessively on the small of her thick back, his slate eyes daring anyone to breathe incorrectly in her presence. Lorenzo Bianchi, the owner who had treated her like a slow-witted pack mule, stood frozen at the maitre d' stand. The color completely drained from his face as he realized who was walking toward him. He looked at Chloe, the fat, exhausted waitress he had fired now, dripping in diamonds and flanked by the most dangerous men on the East Coast. Mr. Costello," Lorenzo stammered, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. Miss Bennett, we didn't know you were coming. I can clear the VIP section immediately. Dominic didn't speak. He simply looked at Chloe, deferring the power entirely to her. Chloe stepped forward. She looked around the dining room. She saw Sophia, the head waitress, who used to mock her wait in the break room, staring in absolute, trembling horror. She saw the wealthy patrons who used to snap their fingers at her, now averting their eyes in fear. "We don't need a table, Lorenzo," Chloe said. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and carried a dangerous edge of authority that sent a shiver down the owner's spine. I don't understand," Lorenzo whispered. Dominic reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed it casually onto the maitre d' stand. "That is the deed to this building, along with a full transfer of the business licenses." Dominic stated, his voice ringing through the silent room. "I bought the property this morning, and I just transferred all ownership to Chloe." Lorenzo's knees practically buckled. He grabbed the edge of the podium to keep from collapsing. "What?" "You work for me now, Lorenzo," Chloe said, stepping closer, her heavy presence entirely dominating the small man. "And there are going to be some changes." Sophia, the skinny head waitress, flinched as if she had been struck. Yes, Miss Bennett. "You're fired," Chloe said calmly. "Clean out your locker, and Lorenzo gulped, nodding frantically. "You're going to order new uniforms, something comfortable, something that breathes. And if I ever hear a whisper of a staff member being mocked for their weight, their background, or their struggles under my roof, I won't just fire you." Chloe leaned in her brown eyes, cold and unyielding. "I will let my fiancé deal with you. Do we have an understanding?" "Yes, Miss Bennett, absolutely. Thank you, Miss Bennett," Lorenzo babbled, bowing his head in pure submission. Chloe turned away from him, feeling a profound, heavy weight lift from her chest. The ghosts of her past humiliations evaporated into the truffle-scented air. She looked up at Dominic. The ruthless Mafia boss was gazing down at her with a look of absolute worship, a dark, proud smile curling his lips. He offered her his arm. She took it, her thick fingers resting against his solid muscle. They walked out of Laura together, leaving the terrified staff in their wake. They stepped out into the cold Boston night, untouchable and supreme. Chloe Bennett was no longer invisible. She was the heaviest, most beautiful, and most lethal queen the city had ever seen, and she would never, ever be pushed to the shadows again. If you were captivated by Chloe's transformation from an exhausted, bullied waitress into the untouchable queen of Boston's underworld, don't keep this thrilling ride to yourself. Hit that like button to show your support for raw, unapologetic revenge stories. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our explosive true-life dramas. Your support helps us bring more gripping, pulse-pounding tales to life. Stay tuned for the next upload.